Well, as we wait for everybody to come back in the room from our early excitement, I'll just mention for the folks online, we just had an impromptu fire drill. So people are gathering back in the room. So just bear with us for a couple of minutes as we get started. I will mention this session is going to go a little bit longer than typical, and maybe even a little teeny bit longer than that given our delay. So just to plan accordingly, and we'll just wait a few minutes while folks find their seats.
Just trying to see how. Are you going to take that computer away after presenting? Or
No, but we can just
scoot
scoot it back.
afterwards,
Yeah,
or
we
like
can
a bookmark?
definitely do that.
I think that will. Yeah, that will fit perfect.
Is that gonna work?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
For getting the mic. Right.
So Steve, he'll light you up. All right, it looks like the majority of people have found their way back. Welcome everybody to the third edition of Crossroads of Ideas for the fall semester 2021. If you are not yet finding a seat, we can grab a chair for you in a moment. Bear with us. Thanks so much, everybody. My name is Laura Heisler. I'm Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Director of Outreach for the Mortgage Institute for Research, and a partner with the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And these three organizations collaborate to create the Crossroads of Ideas series. I'm going to have just a couple of notes about this evening's session, about an upcoming session, and how this evening will go. But before I do, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are on for those of us in the room and for many of you that are on Zoom. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Teejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations in Wisconsin. I do want to mention an upcoming session. Do mark your calendars. The final session of the calendar year, but not of our series this academic year, will be on Tuesday, December 7th at 7 p.m. in this room and also on Zoom. And it will be a conversation about soil, the past, present, and future of a precious resource, featuring Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, Joe Handelsman, Soil Science Professor Alfred Hardemink, and scientist Garth Harrison. About this evening's session, I will just mention that we're going to go, as I mentioned a little earlier, we're going to go a little bit longer than normal. Typically, we end on the hour. This session was planned to go until about 8:30. Now, given that we had about a 5-minute delay with the fire drill, that may go a little bit longer so that we can feature your questions. So in a moment, I'll be turning the podium over to the curator of this mini series within a series, the Big Question series, that this is the second installment of, Larry Shapiro. Before I turn things, once Larry's going to then turn things over to our moderator, Steve Paulson, and you'll have two sequential presentations from our speakers. They'll then come up here and have a bit of a discussion before opening things up to the audience for your questions. If you're in the room and you have a question when we get to that point, please do line up at the microphone here. That's our way of trying to have a touchless interface. If you're not able to make it to the mic, raise your hand and indicate that you need a microphone brought to you, and I'll bring you one. For those of you at home, if you'd like to ask a question, we absolutely are interested in fielding your questions. Use the Q&A function in Zoom rather than the chat, and I will be your spokesperson and read your question. We'll get to as many as we can by about 8:30 or 8:35. If you need to leave early, you're certainly welcome to do so. So with that, I am delighted to introduce the curator of the Big Questions mini-series, Larry Shapiro. Larry is the Barron Ensch Professor of Philosophy here at UW-Madison. Larry, over to you.
I'll start just by thanking Laura, who has been instrumental in organizing the series, as well as Katie Apsey of the IRH and Joe Handelsman, the director of this institute, the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. Today, we're going to focus on the topic of consciousness, and a reason why philosophers and scientists are both puzzled by consciousness and interested in studying it is, well, think about our experience just a couple of minutes ago. We're standing outside. We saw the lights flashing on the fire engine. We smelled the exhaust of the fire engine. We heard the diesel engine running. These experiences, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we smell, we're subject to these experiences. There's something it's like to be having these experiences. And the philosopher asks, well, what are these experiences? Where are these experiences? And one obvious answer is those experiences are in the head. But of course, there's nothing red or smelly. Well, there might be something smelly, but nothing red, nothing that smells like exhaust in my brain. We do think, though, that the brain somehow generates these experiences. But how on earth can something physical, this blob of gray matter, produce that diesel exhaust odor or that perception of flashing red lights? And that question about how the brain can produce or generate conscious experience is a question that philosophers have been working on for quite some time, and scientists as well. And I hope we hear the solution to that question here tonight. But to moderate our discussion, I'm really happy to have in attendance here Steve Paulson, who's the executive producer and one of the founders of To the Best of Our Knowledge. I'm sure we've all heard Steve on the radio. He's also written a book, Atoms and Eden, Conversations on Religion and Science, which Oxford published in 2010. He's now working on another book, exploring the intersection between science, philosophy, and spiritual experience. And among the other things in this book, he'll be exploring the oddities of psychedelics. I volunteered for that part of the book, and near-death experiences. So, Steve, please take it away.
So what is consciousness? That is our little question for the evening. To put this in perspective, just a few decades ago, consciousness barely registered as a credible subject for science, but then various new technologies came along, brain mapping, other kinds of fancy equipment that started giving scientists some tools to look inside the brain and to begin mapping neural connections. And now consciousness is a thriving industry in neuroscience labs, in brain institutes, and philosophers have also gotten into the act. In fact, they're helping to shape this whole conversation. And a few, like Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers, have even suggested that this immaterial world of feelings and subjective experience is beyond what science can ever explain. I'm sure we'll get into that this evening. So there's a lot of debate, many questions about what exactly consciousness is, where it comes from, and what we can ultimately know about it. And lucky for us, we have both a scientist and a philosopher who can help us unpack these questions. So as Laura and Larry said, each will give a short talk, and then we'll have a group conversation, and we'll go from there. So let me introduce our speakers. Jorge Morales is originally from Mexico City, where he received his MA at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. From there, he went to New York City, earning his PhD from Columbia University. He's now finishing up a postdoc at Johns Hopkins University, after which he'll be taking a job as assistant professor at both the departments of philosophy and psychology at Northeastern University in Boston. He'll be directing his own lab called the Subjectivity Lab. I love that, where he'll be able to pursue his interests in neuroscience, philosophy, and consciousness. Excuse me, I just need to have a drink here. I'm not used to talking with a mask on. second speaker, Yury Salman, is Associate Professor of Psychology here at UW, originally from Australia, where he received his PhD in neuroscience from Australian National Institute. Professor Saalmann then held positions at University of Melbourne, University of London, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and Princeton University before arriving here in 2013. He's a winner of a Templeton World Charity Foundation research grant and serves as director of the Saalmann Lab, where he conducts research on how brain networks enable cognitive control and consciousness. His work deepens our understanding of conditions like schizophrenia and ADHD, as well as disorders of consciousness, such as those in comatose patients. So welcome both of our speakers, and we will start with Jorge.
Okay, hello, good night. Thank you so much for this invitation, and thanks everyone for being here. Consciousness starts when we wake up in the morning after dreamless sleep, and it persists throughout the day while we're awake, and it usually ends at night when we go back to bed, or when we fall in a coma, when we go under general anesthesia, or when we die. During your waking life, you undergo many conscious states. You had visual conscious experiences while driving here. You had visual conscious experiences when you have wine or when you taste ice cream. And you also have visual conscious experiences when you suffer from a pain. And thankfully, also when enjoying some pleasurable activity. You experience joy and anger and other emotions in a conscious way. If I ask you to imagine a blue banana projected on the black screen right now, you probably can do that too. Or maybe imagine the face of your sixth grade teacher. You can do that and have an experience of that mental image that you bring back to mind. And the thing is that consciousness is a feature of our mental lives that allows us to be aware of our bodies and our surroundings, and we enjoy and suffer life because we're conscious. Consciousness can motivate actions and shape our decisions in very important ways. As Larry was saying in his introduction, consciousness is what it feels like to be a particular kind of creature with particular kind of states. It's, in other words, the kind of experiences that we have, or in particular, the subjective character of experience. Our beliefs about consciousness shape how we treat each other and other creatures. It shapes what kind of decisions we make about important matters, about life and death. And in other words, consciousness is very important. It is who we are, it makes our life, and it's what we know best. It's a very intimate part of our existence. And yet, consciousness is what I like to call metaphysically funky and epistemically slippery. St. Augustine famously wrote about the concept of time. What then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I try to explain it, I do not know. And I think we can say exactly the same thing about consciousness. On one hand, it's the most familiar thing about our lives. On the other hand, we really don't have a good hold of it. It seems mysterious and we can't define it, and definitely we can't study it in any easy way. So tonight, I want to discuss these two problems about consciousness, how philosophers see it, its funkiness and its slipperiness. And I will present like a view that has permeated in philosophy for a long time. And I think it's very compelling. And it's probably views that you've heard before. Larry advanced some of that feeling about how consciousness might be mysterious and how it's mysterious, how it relates to the physical world, to our brains in particular. But at the end, I'm going to try to say and convince you that despite this mysteriousness, consciousness is pretty, we can study it pretty straightforwardly, despite initial appearances. So why do I say that consciousness is metaphysically funky? Here, metaphysics just refers to what there is, to the nature of things, to the ultimate nature of things. And the thing about consciousness is mainly that it is not a thing. We inhabit a physical world, an objective world that, it's out there with the properties that it has. It exists regardless of whether we exist or not, or whether we know about it or not. And it also doesn't have a point of view. It's objective out there. And it behaves in ways that, display some regularities. And of course, nature is sometimes chaotic. There's a lot of probability, stochasticity. And if we go into the quantum realm, things do get a little bit funky for sure, but there is regularity and there are laws in nature, something that we don't see in the world of the mind. We can poke and bump into physical objects, but we can't grasp a conscious mental state. In fact, consciousness is almost everything that the physical world is not. It is subjective in nature. It involves having a point of view, and it's unclear whether it's governed by any kind of laws. Certainly, we feel at least that we're free, that we have free will. So laws and regularities don't seem to be part of the conscious world. And yet, and here's where the funkiness starts to creep up, it is also a very deeply held belief of our times that consciousness is the product of a physical object. And that's our brain, our body and nervous systems combined, perhaps. And so when you have a glass of wine, the chemical compounds in the wine, a physical object, interact with your physical taste buds and your physical receptors in your very physical olfactory tract, which produce a chemical and electrical series of physical reactions in your very physical nervous system that affects your very physical brain. And somehow this physical process gives rise to the subjective experience of tasting a Cabernet. This process, this translation from the physical world into the world of subjectivity, it's really something that has puzzled philosophers for a long time. And in particular, it has given, it has produced something that it's called the hard problem of consciousness. It was originally introduced by the Australian philosopher David Chalmers. And to understand what the hard problem is, we first have to understand what easy problems are. So the easy problems of consciousness is trying to understand information processing, perceptual discrimination, object recognition, verbal reports, and so on, other type of abilities like this. And when I say that these are easy problems, it doesn't mean that it's very easy to treat them. Scientists and psychologists spend their whole lives basically trying to understand how these processes take place in the brain, but they are technical problems, very hard to solve, but accessible via our current methods and metaphysically normal compared to consciousness. Let me give you a concrete example of these. Let's take a visual perception example. You open your eyes and you see the world, and understanding exactly how we go from photons to hitting our retinas to having a perceptual experience is, of course, nothing trivial. There's nothing trivial about that. But the aspects of this process that do not involve consciousness are or seem more tractable than explaining consciousness. We can use the laws of optics to understand how light travels through the eye and hits the retina, and the image gets inverted. And we can try to understand the algorithms that the mind uses to infer, for example, the color of things, their sizes, their shapes, and so on. Now, the Onion made fun of this problem a few years ago, but size constancy is actually very interesting. it's very hard for a visual system to determine whether something is small and close or far away and big. And yet we do this all the time, our minds do this all the time without any problem. And importantly, we kind of have learned what are the rules that govern these processes. And we're able to build machines that, replicate these phenomena as well. If you have the latest smartphones in your pocket, your camera mode can totally do that. And they know, it knows what is closer and what is farther away and so on, so that you can focus the lens. So it's not an easy problem it's not a totally easy problem, but it is a manageable problem. This is completely not true about consciousness. What we don't understand is how phenomenal character, how the experience of hearing the alarm here or tasting red wine is produced by brain activity. And phenomenal consciousness here, phenomenal is a jargon word that philosophers like, not to mean great or awesome, but to mean phenomenological or pertaining to a phenomenal experience of subjectivity and a qualitative character and so on. And how these phenomenal experiences that we have when we open our eyes, when we taste something, when we feel an emotion, connects to a particular type of neural activity, it's something that might seem kind of mysterious. Why does this particular neural activity creates this particular experience is something that it's not just that we don't understand it as of now. It seems like we don't have the tools for understanding how that connection happens. But now let me shift towards the second problem. Not just how consciousness is funky in a metaphysical way, in a way that gives rise to the hard problem, but it's also slippery epistemically. And here epistemic just means, or it refers to knowledge, to what we can know, in this case, consciousness. And to illustrate these, let me bring back a classic in philosophy, a famous article by Thomas Nagel, What It's Like to Be a Bat, where Nagel asked how we could know what it's like to be a bat, not just describe their behavior or imagine what it will be like to have a collocation or imagine what it will be like to hang upside down, but literally, can we know what it's like to be a bat? And long story short is that Nagel thinks that the answer is no, because the only way of knowing that is to be a bat. And the reason for that is because consciousness is subjective. It's something that you can only get from the inside, as it were. And this creates a problem for scientists and philosophers, because then the only way of knowing whether a creature is conscious or exactly what that consciousness is like seems to be that creature. But of course, that shuts off lots of opportunities for understanding consciousness as researchers. And the epistemic limitation that I just described imposes a huge challenge, because then the best that we can do as researchers, as observers, as inquirers, as people curious about consciousness, is focus on what we can observe. And what we can observe is behavior. But that creates an obvious problem. Consider an actor that is faking to be in pain, or a Spartan warrior who is faking not to be in pain. Their behaviors do not correspond to their experiences. Or consider when you go out and are able to perform an action, but you're really not aware of what you're doing, and suddenly you realize that you did it. And that happens often. For example, when you drive and suddenly you arrive home and suddenly get a moment of realization that you're not totally sure what happened in the last 3 minutes. Maybe you were distracted and whatnot. So it seems like you can do things that look very rational, very normal, and very goal-directed without actually having an experience. But then again, this is a problem for science. But hold on a second. I started this talk by saying that consciousness was the most intimate thing, the thing that we know very well, that we're acquainted with it throughout the day. And wouldn't these be a way of getting access to consciousness? Maybe we can't tell if others are conscious, but maybe we can ask them. Sure, we can't get animals or babies or other creatures to tell us what their experiences are like, but maybe, we can confer with other adults and ask them what their experiences are like. And worst case scenario, we can introspect our own conscious experiences, right? We know what tasting a Cabernet tastes like, what imagining your sixth grade teacher feels like, and so on. So maybe we can take this as a starting point to understand what consciousness is. But the problem with introspection, this ability to read our own minds and know what we're thinking and what we're experiencing, is that it is utterly unreliable. And I know that it might not feel like that, especially for experiences as simple as maybe being cold or seeing a white screen in front of you. But the thing is, introspection can fail not just in cases like these, maybe rarely, but it can fail in cases that we care more about. If I ask you if you're seeing a red apple on the screen, you can introspect that experience, try to see, try to introspect what you're experiencing, and it will be kind of weird if you get that wrong, maybe, right? Like you're looking at it for a long time, you're taking your time, there's good light and so on. But on one hand, that's not what all our experiences are like. And on the other hand, if I ask you to give me more details, right, about your experience, you might not be so comfortable as, when compared to when I just say, like, did you see a red apple or not? Which, by the way, looks a lot like the kind of experiments that people run to test for consciousness. Like, did you see these dots or not? Were the dots moving to the left or to the right? Like, very simple questions. But what about more interesting questions about our conscious experiences? Like, I don't know, if I ask you to ask your sixth grade teacher dancing on a mountain at sunset, if you're really able to bring that image to mind, and then I ask you, what's the color of the pants of your teacher? I don't know if there's an answer for that. I don't know if you imagine any pants. Maybe you just imagine a floating head. Maybe you did imagine a particular type of pants, but it's unclear whether they had color or not, or maybe they had and you forgot. And maybe you're right, and you're telling, you're very good at introspecting. But the point of this example is that once you try to really get a hold of what conscious experiences are like, and you're trying to describe them to yourself or to others, things get really tricky. And it's really unlikely that we can trust those subjective reports completely. So it looks like consciousness, it is metaphysically funky and epistemically slippery. So what can we do about it? One option is lament that we can't study these things, or that it's very tricky, or that maybe science has nothing to do with this topic, because the objective methods of science are not tailored for this kind of problem. But I won't tell you that. What I'm going to tell you is that we can study consciousness both as philosophers and scientists in ways that maybe override these very well held beliefs in I think in the field and outside academia as well. Let's start with the hard problem. It might sound hard because of how it's usually framed, but saying that doing something it's impossible, especially some kind of research is impossible before doing that research, it just strikes me as particularly odd. Saying like, look, we can't explain consciousness scientifically because, and then you insert an argument. It's interesting, it's a good exercise, but I don't think that that's how science works or should work. And therefore, I think that we should kind of ignore the hard problem, to be honest. We ignored it when we controlled fire. Right? We didn't have any theories about fire by the time we control it. We actually didn't have any theories, probably. We didn't have any theories about heritability by the time we started studying it as a phenomenon. We didn't have any theories about DNA by the time we started studying heritability as a phenomenon, and that paid off. We eventually reached a better understanding of how these mechanisms work. So I guess I'm advocating for an optimistic approach to studying what it does look like a very difficult topic. And I'm going to suggest a similar approach with the slipperiness of consciousness. in my field, objective and subjective approaches are always in tension. People always advocate for one or the other and say that, no, you have to focus on behavior. That's the only thing that we can do. We should like try to extract what a person was experiencing by probing their behavior and just make inferences from that. And then the other camp is always like, no, consciousness is subjective. The only true access to it is by subjective reports. So we should ask people what they're thinking, even if, or they're experiencing, even if it's unreliable. And the truth is that I think that we need both, right? I think that that we need an overlap of behavioral data, neural data, and subjective reports, in part because they all tell part of the puzzle. And together, I think we can, after circling a million times and failing a million times, we might start getting good answers. And I want to suggest that there are ways of doing this in a better way, right? Like if there are problems with introspection and there are problems with deriving qualitative properties from physical properties and so on, maybe we should try to focus on, our best case scenario or our best bet for understanding consciousness. And I'm going to end by suggesting what I think this is. I think that we should focus more on the intensity of experiences. I think that philosophers focus a lot on the phenomenal character of experiences. They love talking about it, the redness of red, the smell of the rose and so on, that thing that makes you feel like you're experiencing something. But that is actually very hard to study empirically. And scientists reasonably try to study mostly comparisons between conscious versus unconscious states. And again, that's a very rational or reasonable bet. But I'm going to suggest that these two approaches or these two emphases kind of miss the point a little bit. And to argue for that, let me go back to these examples from the beginning of the talk. They don't have many things in common, having a headache and seeing cars on your way home and feeling joy or drinking a glass of red wine. Really, they only share the fact that they are conscious among them. So I wonder if discovering what's the neural correlates of consciousness of seeing a car in front of you will tell us much about the neural correlates of having a headache. My intuition is that it won't, or it will be a limited piece of the puzzle. The only thing that these things share, other than being conscious, is that they have degrees of intensity. You can experience pain in more intense or less intense way. You can experience wine in a more intense or less intense way. You can be more or less happy. You can picture the face of your sixth grade teacher in a more vivid or less vivid way in your mind's eye. And by focusing on intensity, I think rather than making consciousness mysterious, we're focusing on a property that scientists or an approach that scientists tend to be very good at, and that's a quantity, right? Intensity of experience, how intense your experience is or how conscious you are. It's a quantifiable property of conscious experiences. And I think that that could be a very good in for focusing on our efforts in studying them, in part because introspecting how intense an experience is seems much easier than describing their contents. And introspection is not as reliable as we would like, but it's sometimes reliable. Sometimes we can know what we're feeling and experiencing. And I think that how much we're experiencing something is something that we can get fairly right. So that's the proposal. And I hope that, after these, even though I talk about a little bit of funkiness and slipperiness, we can still feel some awe at how important spatial consciousness is without thinking that it's an untouchable scientific mystery. In fact, I think that part of my job as a philosopher is not just to provide a good characterization of consciousness, but also to suggest better ways of approaching problems that are tractable by science, and also criticizing and deriving inferences and interpretations of scientific discoveries. And because of that, I think it's easy to tell that I think that the best way of studying consciousness is by an interdisciplinary approach. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so happy to be here tonight and so happy to hear the next talk and have a conversation with you and with the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Can I just test this? Yep, and then slide forward to the right. There we go. Okay. And is there a laser pointer on this? Yep, this little green light right there. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Turn your microphone on.
You don't want me to use that one?
Use your lavalier.
Okay. Good evening, all. When I was invited to what they said was a fireside chat today, I didn't think they'd actually light the place up before we started. But so I want to touch on this concept of neural correlates of consciousness that Jorge raised. And neuroscientists might define it as only that brain activity that's necessary and sufficient for consciousness. So to elaborate, if you ask a neuroscientist, I'm sure they'll say that, yes, the actual brain gives rise to consciousness. Whoops. Let's go back. There we go. Perfect, sorry, we'll start again. So gives rise to consciousness, but as it turns out, not all parts of the brain seem to be necessary for consciousness. For example, if we actually look at the back of the brain here, we have, and I'll get it right eventually, the cerebellum, as you can see here, which is involved in fine motor control, among other functions. However, if you experience damage to the cerebellum, consciousness persists, which suggests that the cerebellum is actually not required for consciousness. In contrast, a number of other parts of the brain have been proposed as vital for consciousness, and many of them have been labeled here. But what I want to do just for now is focus on the surface of the brain, which is known as the cerebral cortex. And there are some neuroscientists who will hold that the frontal cortex, shown here, is actually vital for consciousness. And this might not be surprising to you, considering the large expansion of the frontal lobe across mammalian evolution. However, if you have damage to the frontal lobe, you don't always have a reduction in the level of consciousness. So this has led other neuroscientists to suggest that maybe more posterior parts of the brain, such as the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, may actually contribute more to consciousness. And this is the underpinning of the so-called front versus back debate, which is actually a prominent one in consciousness science. So we can actually weigh in on this debate using behavioral techniques and neuroimaging. Let's start with a behavioral task that's useful, which exploits the actual phenomenon of binocular rivalry. So the idea here is that you're going to present a different visual stimulus to each eye. So you can do that by having a divider between the eyes or specialized goggles. So in this particular case, we're going to present these green bars moving to the left, only to the left eye. And we're going to present these red bars only moving to the right eye, okay? And so what subjects actually perceive now is sometimes they will only perceive leftward moving green bars. And at other times, they'll only perceive rightward moving red bars, all right? And we can get some insight into what people are thinking by asking for their voluntary report. For example, they might press a left button on the keyboard to signify this leftward motion perception, and a right button on the keyboard to signify this rightward motion perception. We also get, for free in a way, an automatic readout of the perceptions of the subjects, because as it turns out, the eyes actually move with the perceived direction of motion. So you can see a different pattern of eye movements when the subject perceives just this leftward motion versus this altered pattern of eye movements when they perceive this rightward motion. Okay, so that's the behavioral task we're going to use. We're going to now put the subject in an MRI scanner. So what we can do is actually monitor the brain activity of the subject while they're performing this task. So here what I have shown is one hemisphere of the human brain. We're looking at it from the front. Now these areas in yellow and red are the parts of the brain that are activated, more excited, when you actually have these alternations between these different perceptions, either to the left or to the right. And so basically, we're going to see this area here, which is the frontal lobe. And you'll notice there's an activation of the brain there, as well as an activation in more posterior parts of the brain, the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. All right. So we have the readout of subjects. They've been pressing leftward and rightward buttons, depending if they're perceiving left motion or right motion. Now, one of the problems we have in this experiment is that the frontal lobe here is involved in the planning and execution of voluntary movements. So if we're pressing buttons, maybe this brain activation here is not due to consciousness in any way. It's actually due to this, actions that we're performing. So the experimenters actually repeated this experiment, but now subjects weren't required to actually press the buttons. However, we still had a readout of the subject's perceptions just by looking at their eye movements, as I described before. So now, without this voluntary report of pressing buttons, you can see that the actual frontal lobe is no longer activated. However, we still have activations more posteriorly in the brain. So this raises the question of whether the frontal lobe is actually necessary for conscious awareness. So what I'd like to do now, after talking about different brain areas that may be necessary for consciousness, is to talk a little more about the patterns of electrical activity in those brain areas that are necessary for consciousness. So we're going to talk about an EEG experiment. So this involves putting electrodes on the scalp to non-invasively monitor the electrical activity of the brain. And then what we're going to do is stimulate the brain using a technique known as transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS for short. All right, so again, another non-invasive method in which we apply a magnetic pulse to the brain, and this induces electrical currents. All right, so what we're going to do now is see the response of the brain to this stimulation in the wake state. All right, so we stimulate the brain, and you can see here that there's a response, from the brain, not unexpectedly. So these red lines show a significant change in the electrical activity of the brain compared to baseline. So you'll notice in the wake state here, we get these fluctuations of electrical activity that seem to reverberate, and it's prolonged activity over hundreds of milliseconds in the wake state. All right. Now the activity also spreads far and wide across the brain, and we can see that in the bottom row here. We're looking at top views of the brain, and we're seeing how time advances after the stimulation. So if you look here at the first time point, you have the point of stimulation, which happens to be called the premotor cortex. And what you'll notice soon afterwards, the activation spreads. That's this red-yellow color here. It spreads to the opposite hemisphere. It spreads more posteriorly. It activates the back of the brain. So in the wake state, you've got prolonged activity that spreads across the brain. Let's compare this to what happens in a reduced conscious state, such as sleep. And we can see that here on the right. So basically now, if you stimulate the brain at this point here, you can see that there is an initial response. However, it peters out very quickly. You can see we're back to baseline within 150 milliseconds. So we don't have this prolonged activity in the sleep state. And if we look in the bottom row here, you can see that we don't get the spread of activity across the brain either. We stimulate here in premotor cortex, and it stays rather localized across time. So what this tells us is that in the awake state, in states of increased consciousness, we have temporally and spatially complex brain activity in comparison to reduced conscious states like sleep and anesthesia. So what I'd like to do now is sort of just talk a little bit more about the importance of this work beyond the scientific questions or philosophical questions, and think about what can this research do for us clinically? all right? Well, it can actually help us treat disorders of consciousness. So what I've got here plotted is a number of different conscious states along two different axes, which are useful clinically. So on the x-axis here, we have the level of arousal, how vigilant you are, and you can gauge this by looking at whether the subject's eyes are open, for example. And on the y-axis, we've got the level of awareness, the richness of your perceptual experience. And basically, you can get a handle on this by listening to someone's response to a question like, do birds fly south for the winter? All right. So conscious wakefulness, as we find ourselves now, hopefully, whereas high levels of awareness and arousal. And then later tonight, you'll be in a state of sleep with lower levels of awareness arousal. And then, unfortunately, there are disorders of consciousness in which there are very low levels of awareness arousal, such as coma. You also have other types of disorders of consciousness resulting from traumatic brain injury, for example, such as unresponsive wakefulness and a minimally conscious state with impaired awareness. So one goal clinically would be to actually, for example, in the minimally conscious state, to actually intervene and move the state closer towards the conscious wakefulness state. All right. So one means of actually doing this is using an approach known as deep brain stimulation. So here, if we focus on the center of the brain here, there's a region known as a thalamus. And a particular part of the thalamus, the central thalamus that's highlighted here in red, has a close association with consciousness. And part of this evidence here is that if you damage the central thalamus, shown here in red, you can give rise to disorders of consciousness such as acute coma. Okay, so one strategy with deep brain stimulation would be to implant electrodes here in the central thalamus, and via these anatomical connections that reach out to all across the surface of the brain, the cerebral cortex, we can try to activate widespread regions of the brain in disorders of consciousness. And this is actually being done. A few years ago, there was a patient in a minimally conscious state, and they were in this state of reduced awareness for 6 years prior to the deep brain stimulation. So what you can see here on the left are the actual deep brain stimulating electrodes implanted deep in the center of the brain in that central thalamus. And a reminder here that there's no actual pain receptors in the brain. So subjects don't actually feel these electrodes in the brain. And we know this because this deep brain stimulation technique has been used in severe cases of Parkinson's disease for decades, and it's proven to be safe and effective. Okay, so when the clinicians actually stimulated the central thalamus, there was a marked change in the behavior of the subject. So prior to that, there was relatively low levels of arousal. So that's this pre-state here. And then when they stimulated this central thalamus deep in the brain, they got an increase in arousal shown by the blue bar. They got an increase in verbal communication where subjects who couldn't respond to commands now could now respond in whole sentences. And they got increased motor activity, including the ability to feed themselves or pick up tools, all right? So stimulation of this central thalamus increased the behavioral responsiveness and level of consciousness of these patients, all right? So we can now turn to animal models to get a better idea of the underlying neural mechanisms. So here we have a side view of a macaque monkey brain, and we can record from neural activity across the brain, such as the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and deep in the center of the brain, the central thalamus, that area that we were just talking about that we were stimulating. So we're going to zoom in on that central thalamus, which you can see here, and we have for orientation the midline of the brain. And this area in yellow is a special part of the central thalamus known as the central lateral nucleus. And we're going to use the abbreviation CL for now, okay? So clinically currently tend to use these relatively large electrodes and stimulate through only 1 or 2 contacts in the brain. So we can actually use very different electrodes now, which actually are much smaller and have between dozens to hundreds or even thousands of electrode contacts in the brain, all right? So this will allow us to manipulate neural activity on a much finer scale if we perform deep brain stimulation. Okay, and we also have modern neuroimaging methods, which really allow us to finely and precisely target our electrodes to these very small regions of the brain. So what I want to do first is characterize the neural activity in the central thalamus to understand why the deep brain stimulation seems to wake people up. And so what you can see here at top right is a raw trace of the electrical activity in this yellow region deep in the center of the brain, CL nucleus, central thalamus. So first, for orientation, these sharp deflections of electrical activity are called action potentials. These electrical pulses are what individual neurons or brain cells use to transmit information to each other. As it so happens, in the wake state, typical neurons in the central thalamus might actually generate up to 50 electric pulses per second, all right? And then if you go into a reduced conscious state, such as sleep and anesthesia, their activity comes down markedly to as low as 10 electrical pulses per second. So we've got this modulation of electrical activity according to the level of consciousness, right? So as a next step, what we can try to do is model a disorder of consciousness, maybe give general anesthesia to the subject, and see if we can override the system by electrically stimulating at 50 times a second, as shown here, to mimic the activity of the neurons, which are also firing at 50 times a second in the wake state. And that's what we did. So you can see that on this slide here. Basically, we have along the x-axis time across the experiment. And on the y-axis, we've got a number of behavioral and neural indicators. So here, the actual animal was receiving a constant administration or delivery of an anesthetic drug known as propofol. It's widely used clinically, all right? So what you'll notice prior to any deep brain stimulation, not surprisingly for an anesthetized state, the eyes are closed, there's little muscle activity in the EMG, basically the animal is still in an anesthetized state, and in the EEG from these electrodes on the scalp, we have these large slow waves, right, that basically disrupt information processing, typical of low conscious states. And we also have these slow oscillations in the brain, in electrodes implanted in the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. All right, so let's see what happens when we actually stimulate the brain, overriding the system by mimicking the activity of these neurons on a fine scale by stimulating at 50 times a second. When we do this, within a couple of seconds, the animal wakes up, even though we're still administering the same level of the anesthetic drug propofol. So you can see that the eyes open, we get increased activity in the EMG, and these slow waves are greatly reduced from the EEG and deeper in the brain. At the same time, the animal starts moving about and reaching to objects in the environment, suggesting that it's actually perceiving the world around them, and they have changes in vital signs. So we were able to override the anesthetized system by stimulating in a fashion that mimics the activity of the neurons that would typically be seen in the wake state. And so you can see that when we switch off the stimulation, within a few seconds, the animal goes back to a reduced conscious state. The eyes are closed, there's little muscle activity, and we get the resumption of these slow waves. And we can do this time and time again. It's very reproducible, okay? In fact, we have bidirectional control of consciousness, because when we repeat this experiment, but with the animal awake, we try to override the system now by stimulating this central thalamus area deep in the brain at the activity level of neurons during sleep and anesthesia at a very low rate with 10 pulses per second. And when we did that, we could actually reduce the level of consciousness of the animal. So this purposeful manipulation of the system suggests that the thalamus deeper in the brain is vital for consciousness. So what I want you to also notice is that deep within the cerebral cortex, there are also changes occurring. And that's what I'd like to focus on next. And we're really going to get to a fine-grained scale just to see where neuroscience is at the cutting edge, okay? So what we have here in green, neurons in the cerebral cortex and the surface of the brain. So I'm going to highlight two important parts of the neurons for you now. One is the dendrites, as shown up here. This is the input to the neuron, and this receives information from other neurons, all right? And then we also have the cell body here, known as the soma, which actually is close to the output of the neuron, right? It sends information to other neurons it's connected with. And so what the experimenters did was record from both of these sites simultaneously, the dendrites and the cell body to see how signaling changed along this pathway, along an individual neuron, when we change the level of consciousness. So let's focus on the top right for now, when we're recording from the dendrites, the input to the neuron. So what you'll see in red here is that there's, in the wake state, changes in activity that occur at the level of the dendrites. And although there's a slight reduction in the anesthetized state, there's still a significant change in activity from the baseline. So what this suggests is that even in the anesthetized state, like the wake state, the neuron can still receive information from other neurons, all right? So now let's see what's happening at the cell body or soma, right? And that's at the bottom right here. So if you look at the red trace, you can notice that there's big changes in activity in the awake state, but now in the anesthetized state, there's minimal change as shown by the black curve. So what this suggests is that what's important for the conscious state is signaling along these individual neurons along this path. But if you disrupt this signaling, then you get a reduced conscious state as you find in anesthesia. All right. So for the final time I have here tonight in this talk, what I'd like to talk about is how we can map brain structure and activity to subjective experience to try to make headway towards that hard problem of consciousness that Jorge mentioned earlier. So what we have here, and I'll explain why we're using a ferret later, we have a lateral view of the ferret brain, right? And basically, typically the eye sends information to the back of the brain here, to a part of the brain known as primary visual cortex, or V1, all right? So I'm gonna call it V1 from now on. So we can zoom in on V1, and we're gonna look at it from above, and you can see that on the left portion of this slide here, all right? And so what the experimenters did in this case is inject a chemical into the vicinity of the neurons, brain cells, at this red asterisk, in order to label the other neurons it's connected with. So you can see anatomical connections with nearby neurons, that's these colored areas here. And you can see anatomical connections with parts of the brain that are further away. So you can see this distributed pattern of activity, and this may reflect our ability to tie together extended objects across our visual environment, all right? So what I want to now look at is how the ear sends information to a different part of the brain, known as the primary auditory cortex, or A1 for short. I'm going to use A1 as the acronym for this region. So we can zoom in there, and if you look above, we can see a very different pattern of anatomical connections in A1, auditory cortex, versus V1, visual cortex. So in auditory cortex, we have these local dense connections here that are colored, right? Which might reflect the way we process different frequencies of sounds. And that's very different to the distributed pattern in V1. Now, what was really elegant in these series of experiments is that instead of having information from the ear sent to the primary auditory cortex, basically they rewired the brain. In the ferret, they're born quite young in terms of the developmental stage of the brain. So it makes these sort of manipulations a little bit easier, even though they're incredibly hard, all right? So they rewired the system such as now the eye sent information to the primary auditory cortex, or A1. All right, so let's zoom in now in the rewired A1, which you can see on the right side of this slide. So what your first thing I hope you notice is that the same brain area, A1, has two very different pattern of connections when it's being rewired. So in the normal A1, when it's receiving information from the ears, you get these local dense connections as is shown here. And when you have the rewired A1, which now receives information from the eyes, you can see this distributed pattern of connections, which looks very similar to the normal V1, which normally is processing our visual environment. And so the question now is that when you activate this rewired A1, auditory cortex, which normally processes the sounds that we all hear, does the ferret have an auditory experience or a visual experience? And to get at the heart of that question, the experiment is used the particular behavioral task shown here. So the ferret would start the task at this location here. Within this enclosure, you had a number of lights and you had some sound speakers. And so the ferret was trained such that when it heard a sound coming from the speaker, it would move towards the auditory spout on the left side of the enclosure to receive a reward. And then if it saw a light illuminated, it was trained to move towards the visual spout on the right side to receive the reward. So this allows us to infer that if a ferret moves to the left side, it might be having an auditory experience. And if it moves to the right side, it might be having a visual experience. Okay, so now when we have the ferret with a normal A1, right, when, basically has this local dense pattern of connections in A1, maybe not surprisingly, the ferret moves towards the auditory reward spout, suggesting that it was having an auditory experience. But what happens now when we actually rewire the brain? And now we have the same part of the brain, A1, having a very different pattern of anatomical connections distributed across the surface of the brain. Well, the ferret actually moves towards the visual reward spout. And this suggests that now the actual ferret was having a visual experience. And why I think this experiment is very important is because it really allows us to sort of look at a number of other animals' brains and say, well, if we have a pattern of dense local connections like this in the cerebral cortex, well, maybe that means that that animal can have auditory experiences, just maybe like us. And if it has this distributed pattern of anatomical connections across the brain, maybe that animal can have visual experiences just like us. Now, Jorge, mentioned Thomas Nagel's question of what is it like to be a bat? Well, approaches just like this might help us make some headway on that question. Although in this case, it's was it like to be a ferret? So in summary, although neuroscientists might debate precise locations of brains that are brain areas necessary for consciousness, I think most of us would agree that the cerebral cortex on the surface of the brain and probably the thalamus deeper in the center of the brain are required for consciousness. And the evidence for this, at least one piece is that we can use techniques such as deep brain stimulation to manipulate consciousness in a purposeful fashion. And finally, to get at that hard problem of consciousness, maybe methods just like this might give us a way forward to tackle that question of mapping particular patterns of brain structure and activity to our subjective experience, also known as qualia. Thank you.
Easier one. Come here, Bill.
Oh, you want to stay?
Yep.
Okay.
So that was wonderful. Thank you for those very interesting talks. And I want to broaden the discussion, pull out a little bit and ask some, I think there's some pretty big questions about the nature of consciousness. And to me, the big question is, where does it come from? And so this is a question that I'll pose to both of you. What do you see as the essential attributes of a conscious being? Do you think you need a brain, nervous system? Do you need a certain kind of network connectivity? Do you need to be a biological being? Could it be something else? What is essential for consciousness? Yuri, let me start with you.
Yeah, so I'll be interested in hearing Jorge's view too, because Jorge's hiding the fact that he's also a neuroscientist at heart, I think, seeing his past work. But I think there are a number of major theories of consciousness. And in all of these major theories, basically there's one common component, is that there's always interactions between neurons in the brain. All right, so it seems to me that you need a certain number of neurons that can communicate with each other, causally influence each other to represent information. And the more information states that can be represented, the greater the richness or complexity of your conscious experience. I don't think it needs to be neurons per se. I think it's possible to have other, inorganic representations of that sort of structure. But I think causal interactions between neurons that represent information are important. Yeah.
Jorge?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I will be remiss to if I didn't know that Larry Shapiro, who introduced us, has written a lot about this problem, and it will be surprising that we depended on a particular structure for creating these phenomena. I think that surely what we see is that here on Earth, what consciousness seems to be tied to brains that have a particular juicy nature, but it is the interactions and it's the structure and the way information is processed most likely what gives rise not just to consciousness but to the mind in general.
You're saying it's the way it's wired, it's the connectivity. So you don't necessarily need neurons. There could be machine consciousness then.
I think so. Yeah. But the number of information processing units, neurons or otherwise, does have, I think, an impact on the richness of your experience. We have 86 billion neurons, give or take, in the brain. Mice might have 70 million. There are other animals with hundreds of neurons. I think that with more neurons, you can represent greater number of experiences, states, or whatever else. And I think that helps to give us richer experience. So, yeah.
So how far do you think consciousness goes down? Does it, and if we're talking about the biological world, I assume that we would say that all mammals have some degree of consciousness, maybe birds, certain cephalopods, octopuses, among others. What about insects? What about going down even further to bacteria? What's your best guess?
Undergraduates, I'm kidding. I'm sorry if anyone's in my class. It's a very lame joke. Please, wait.
I think it's a really tricky question, in part because of what I talked about. It's really easy to follow behavior or brain structure or evolutionary history and try to make inferences about what other creatures' experiences are like. And I think the problem is that the answer can go either way, right? Like other mammals have extremely similar structures to us, extremely similar evolutionary histories. It will be extremely surprising that consciousness somehow magically arrived at the very specific line that humans belong to. On the other side, on the other hand, it's really an inference, and I think that it's very important that I point out that it's an inference that we make. It's an educated guess based on some likelihood about other processes, but
that's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
I want you to make educated guesses.
I think that it will depend on. I think the best that we can do is make a guess about the brain structures that look more like ours. So I will be very confident to say that maybe most mammals enjoy the kind of phenomenology that we enjoy, and I'm actually not so sure about anything else.
What about the octopus? Very intelligent. Yeah.
I think that that's a good point. I think that intelligence and consciousness can really be orthogonal. I think that having an experience that feels in a particular way might be related to being intelligent, but it might not. Philosophers like to make this distinction between axis consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, which basically distinguishes between what it's like to be aware of the world and have that the red looks red and the green looks green and the chocolate tastes of chocolate, versus this ability to process information, keep things in working memory, like when you rehearse a phone number and trying to remember it, or solve problems. That's something that can be done without this feeling or this awareness that we've been discussing. So I think it's an open question.
Yuri, what's your guess?
Yeah, so I agree with Jorge that you could take the approach of looking at brains of other species and say, well, do they have similar structures as us? And, if you do something like that, most mammalian species have a cerebral cortex, thalamus, the areas that we're discussing today. Another approach could be taken, thinking about the current theories of consciousness that are out there, right? So there, as I mentioned, there's a debate, front versus back of the brain, which is more important for consciousness. There are a group of theories such as global neuronal workspace theory, higher order theories, which suggest that the frontal lobe is critical, right? And so we have a frontal lobe, the great apes, old world monkeys, new world monkeys. But then when you get to the mouse, for example, and rat, it starts getting a little bit trickier because their frontal cortex, normally, we have 6 layers in our frontal cortex of cells, and rodents only have 5. They miss one critical layer, layer 4, which some people would argue, not all, but would say they don't have the prefrontal cortex, the most advanced part of the frontal lobe. So in those higher order theories, if these mice or a rat doesn't have that part of the frontal lobe, that would suggest, according to those theories, that it might not be conscious, right? So that's one approach. But there are other theories such as, integrated information theory, which says less about what part of the brain's anatomy is important, but more about the types of structures, the wiring between processing units, whether they be neurons or otherwise, that give rise to consciousness. And I think that allows for a whole range of species, all the way down, down evolutionary speaking, to reptiles or whatever else, which may be able to have some rudimentary conscious experience. It's difficult to say what it would be like, but because of the limited number of neurons in the brain, they have a very low representational capacity. They have a very low number of states relative to us that they can actually represent. So their experience would be very sparse. So I think there are a number of different approaches allowed to get there, but what we need is data, right? We need people to get in the lab, from my perspective, because that's how I earn my living, and test these sort of ideas.
So you've both been making the case that basically you need a brain to be conscious, and yet you said earlier that maybe some sort of AI, some very complicated artificial network could be conscious. So how would that work when you've just been making this case that you need this particular brain structure?
Well, I was making a very conservative case, saying I feel much more comfortable about saying, let's say a monkey is conscious versus some elaborate, computer. But I think, the conscious computer, if there was such a thing, would have certain characteristics that we shared, right? They'd have to be able to represent information about the world around us. They might have some set of memories that they can sort of identify as being part of themselves, so they can self-reference consciousness. And if you really want to move back to different theories, there'd be certain patterns of information representation that they'd have to uphold. So they would have to, let's think about this. There would have to be more information according to integrated information theory, basically encoded by the entire system, the higher device, more so that would be in any of its parts. And so we have that sort of, I think, representational capacity in our brains. I think a computer would also have that more than the sum of its parts ability to represent information. But these are just, like educated guesses, I guess.
Jorge, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's nothing magical about prefrontal cortex. I think the reason why people who think that prefrontal cortex is crucial, it's mostly based on evidence, on what we found on humans and other animals that are very close to us, like monkeys, where we see that prefrontal cortex seem to play a crucial role. But there's nothing special, in and of itself, such that lacking a prefrontal cortex will be the end of our ability to have conscious experiences. The reason I don't want to venture is it's because we know that humans have conscious experiences, and I think that that's basically the end of it. The rest of the species that we attribute consciousness to it's based on inferences, and we use our own brain structure to extrapolate to other species. And then when species like maybe mice, but birds have incredibly complex behavior, but their brains are incredibly different from ours, or octopuses. So it's not that I don't think that those animals are conscious. I'm just thinking, if we're going to extrapolate from us and the brain structure that we know can hold consciousness to different structures, it's to some extent a leap of faith. And I think that what we will need to have is, well, more data, but also an understanding of the function that prefrontal cortex, for example, it's doing. It's the function that, according to some of these theories, is some kind of like supervising role on representations that are held in different parts of the brain that kind of make us conscious. And if we can find that function, then we can maybe start to suspect that a creature or an organism is conscious, and that could be done with prefrontal cortex on silicon or in extremely different brains from ours. It's just that we don't know. I don't think we can know at the moment.
It's not exactly clear to me why we have consciousness to begin with. I mean, you could have an organism out there that detects, has very good detection of everything that's happening in the environment, would respond, would be able to tell that there is smoke in the air, and would act accordingly without any kind of subjective experience. So what's the point of consciousness?
I mean, there's one idea that's been put forward is that consciousness helps us identify the moment that we're currently in. And so we have a very rich experience in this moment. And if, at other times you want to be using information from your memories to guide behavior, when you recall that, it's not the same vividness, right? And so I think this labeling of the moment with consciousness helps us identify what's happening here and now when we're also accessing information from other times that are stored in our brain. That's one idea. I think Gregory put that forward. Beyond that, yeah,
I mean, there could be zombies around that, just have no consciousness, but would do just fine surviving, right?
I'm gonna be less optimistic than Yuri. I think that it's unclear. I think it's a question that it's not very easy to answer, because we, at least to some extent, we do have evidence that unconscious behavior can be sophisticated, right? There are these experiments with they use professional chess players, and they display board configurations with particular plays, and they do it in a way that subjects are unconscious of seeing the board. So if you ask them, did you see a board? They will say, like, there was nothing on the screen. And then they are asked to guess, was that a checkmate move or not? And then when they guess correctly. So it's not just that we can detect like a patch on the screen or pass like a simple task. It seems like we can, even without being aware of seeing anything, a professional chess player can detect whether it's checkmate or not. So I think that it's unclear evolutionarily what the benefits of consciousness are. I think that, if I were to speculate, well, first of all, we don't have a reason. We don't need a reason, right? Maybe it just happened and there was no reason for it. But if there is a function for consciousness, I think flexibility will be key. It's true that a complex AI could be flexible and everything can go under the hood, as it were. It can happen without consciousness. But the fact that we can do certain things without consciousness doesn't mean that it's better to do them without them. Right?
Explain why the subjective experience would help with being more flexible. I mean, okay, I have a more intense experience of, I don't know, red, or something smells a certain way. How does that make me more flexible?
I think it has to do with how consciousness interacts with our desires and motivations. Tony Marcel, a British scientist who studied these things, said about blind sight patients. Blind sight patients are these patients that have a lesion in their V1, in their visual cortex, such that in some regions of their visual space, they can't see consciously things, but they can process visually. So they can guess correctly what's there, but they're not aware of seeing anything in a particular region of their visual field. And Tony Marcel said of blind sight patients, like, I know that they can guess, and it's impressive that they can process all this information, but it's unclear whether a thirsty blind sight patient that has a bottle of water right in the spot where they can't see anything will reach out for water. And I think that's the right intuition. I think feeling pain, feeling pleasure, seeing colors, things standing out in our conscious field, it allows to synthesize information in a way that maybe if everything was unconscious, it would be harder, especially to be in control of how we control our bodies and behave in the world and so on.
So we have seen in recent years a remarkable effort in a number of labs to map simple organisms so far. I mean, to sort of do the complete brain mapping. So let me speculate or put out a hypothetical. Suppose the human brain is totally mapped at some point, all those 86 billion neurons, the trillions of synaptic connections, and be the greatest scientific achievement in history. Would we understand consciousness then?
I don't think having the exact map on its own would give us that information. I mean, not only is it not a static entity because the connections are changing over time, each person's sort of pattern of connections is different. And so, although that would be amazing and might allow us to target certain treatments for psychiatric disorders or neurological orders, in a much more precise fashion and avoid side effects with current, pharmacological regimens, I don't think that would be the be all end all.
What would we not understand still?
Well, I mean, just knowing the patterns of connections, doesn't really tell us much about, the types of neural activity, for example, that we know seems to correlate, to different states of consciousness. So when you have an awake state, like I was alluding to earlier in the evening, you have activity which is ongoing and it's complex, and the activity of many neurons can represent a lot of information. But what you often see in reduced conscious states like coma or for example, general anesthesia, is that you'll see parts of the brain that are very active for short periods, maybe 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, then there'll be long pauses where there's no activity at all. So that really disrupts the information processing. And so it would seem that you can look at a clinician or a neuroscientist and they see these different patterns of activity, they can tell you whether the subject is, unconscious or awake or whatever else. You can use machine learning techniques to classify whether, this particular subject's in what conscious state. The anatomical connections don't really on their own give us insight into these different patterns of activity. So it'll be helpful, but I don't think it's the full story. Yeah.
All right, what would we still not understand about consciousness, even with that kind of mapping of the neural correlates?
Yeah, I agree. That kind of mapping would be like having a printed map of a city and trying to infer the traffic patterns of the city. You could certainly infer certain things, right? You can see that there are avenues that are bigger, and maybe that means that more cars can drive there, and maybe you can tell that going from these place to these place will be extremely slow because there are no direct paths and something like that. So we can learn something from anatomy. I think that it's not that we wouldn't, but these kind of connections are a little bit meaningless if we don't map them into function and how they talk to each other. I think but this is also, I mean, regardless of whether we have a perfect map of every neuron and every synapse, even what we have now, it's a mix. We know, or we can find what the neural correlates of consciousness are by kind of overlapping different levels. I think that will be the key, right? Like with neuroimaging, like fMRI, for example, we know a lot about like blood consumption, oxygen consumption in the brain, which is a very indirect measure of how our brain works, and we can do kind of work that Yuri was talking about with EEG or even single cell recordings of exactly how when a neuron fires and so on, and then we need to map that to behavior, and we need to map that to subjective reports, of which animals can provide, like the fur going to one place or another. That will count as a type of subjective report. And I think that it's going to be, if we figure out consciousness and how it works in the brain, it's going to be an exercise of linking different levels and different approaches. It's probably not going to rely on a single technique or a single level at which we can describe these, because in the end it's not our brains that are conscious, right? It's people or animals that are conscious. And, we try to focus a lot in the brain because we know that that's part of the key of consciousness. But in the end, it's our organisms, complete organisms that behave in a particular environment. So we'll need to bridge across different levels, I think.
So we're already starting to run short of time. And so if you have questions, please come up to the mic and we'll have time for at least a couple. One question before that, I mean, we have the privilege of having both a scientist and a philosopher here. I mean, you're kind of both, Jorge, but are there, and I'm going to direct this question to you, are there specific philosophical questions about consciousness that are not really science questions, do you think?
That are not science questions?
Yeah.
I think that there are specific philosophical questions that are not science questions for sure. And I think that applies to consciousness and many other things.
What about specifically consciousness?
I think, I mean, there are many things that I want to be careful about my answer, because I don't want to give the wrong impression that, that science is not the way of approaching or increasing our understanding of consciousness. But there are certain things that, they're just not the right type of question for our scientific
Give me one
methods.
example.
Like, for example, like the meaning of consciousness for life, right? Like the kind of questions that we can ask, like at the end of life, when someone is suffering, for example, and we want to balance out whether that suffering is enough or it's time to end it, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's really like completely out of the purview of the scientific method. And I think that's I just think that there are questions about the structure of consciousness or even questions that scientists might want to discuss when they're doing science. Those are philosophical questions that are not answerable by data when we are doing theories or when we're trying to describe the properties that consciousness have are just something that we need to think about as opposed to go and experiment. But that doesn't mean that these two can't coexist.
Okay, we have some questions here, so let's go to the mic.
So I was surprised that you use the word consciousness all the time, but you rarely use the word awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And at the beginning of your talk, Jorge, I would replace most of the 3 minutes word consciousness to awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I go to sleep, I am no longer aware, but my consciousness is still alive. And the next question would be about self-awareness.
I've always struggled with making a precise distinction between those two words. I think in some cases they are interchangeable, and in some cases awareness do have this connotation that you suggest of a kind of self-aware, self-reflection, where
in French we don't have these two words, and the English language has the advantage of having these two words.
Well, I'm a Spanish speaker.
Many times they are not interchangeable.
Yeah, I'm a Spanish native speaker, and maybe that's why we also don't have two different words, and maybe that's why I just think that awareness and consciousness are the same.
And I think that in neuroscience, for example, we do use the words differently, right? So consciousness is maybe the whole experience. And, as I alluded to in one way of representing conscious states, awareness is, one sort of dimension of the conscious experience, the richness of your perceptual experience, right? And so, that's why I wouldn't use them necessarily. So I'm fogging up interchangeably. But, when you go to sleep, I think it's a little bit more, complex than just saying awareness disappears or whatever else, right? So you have dream states, obviously, we all do during, certain portions of sleep.
What got me is that Jorge said it stops, right? So I don't feel like it stops.
Yeah, we're just not connected to the environment, right? Please.
But in the animals that you could add also the dolphins as being animals that could be aware, similar to us.
Oh, I think so. And I mean, you're right. I mean, when I say that consciousness ends when we go to sleep, I mean, as soon as you literally are not aware of the environment, but then it does resume in these peculiar way, which are dreams.
I understand what you meant, but I believe that in that context, the word awareness in English would work better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'll let them.
Okay, let's go on to our next questioner.
you made a lot of interesting comments about the possibility for mechanical consciousness, like through AI or computers. I wonder, do you think it's possible that the internet is somehow currently conscious, and perhaps why not? It seems unlikely.
I hope not, from what I see on the internet. To think that TikTok is the evolution of the next stage of consciousness frightens me to no end. Yeah, yeah, I guess, there are certain ways of trying to understand whether something else is conscious, right? Turing test, for example, right? You could sort of set up a situation where you ask, some entity a series of questions, and you could see based on their answers, does that seem like something that a human might say, who's conscious? And if I ask the internet questions via Google or some other search engine, the answers it usually gives me are usually foul or pornographic. So whether I ask about which part of the brain or which restaurant, so I don't think it necessarily internet behaves like a human would in terms of answering questions.
Is it missing some mechanical part? Like, is there a corollary to some piece of the brain or some functionality or some layer that's missing?
I mean, if I was going to sort of, again, run with this analogy, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I mean, it's a distributed system across many different neurons that don't really have the sort of connections that seem to be present in, organic sort of entities that seem to support consciousness like us or great apes, in my opinion. So I guess it doesn't have the right structure to represent information just in the way that we do. But again, this is my bias.
I will say anecdotally that I've talked with Christoph Koch, who's a very prominent researcher on consciousness, neuroscientist, who speculates that it would be possible for the internet to be conscious. He was saying, there are the level of connectivity of the internet is probably approaching the level of connectivity in the human brain. He says, maybe the internet could be sad. Anyway, just throw that out there. We're going to go to an online question.
Can you hear me? Yeah, we have a question from Raj asking if consciousness has a genetic component and a time component. In that, does it grow as you age?
Yeah, I think. I mean, in terms of time, I think that's something that it's we didn't mention much in terms of developmental history of an organism. I think it really depends on what we mean. I think that there is a sense in which, the phenomenal type of consciousness, the subjective character of consciousness, where you process the environment and it comes with a subjective feeling, it's likely to be present, at least in humans. I think it will be part of what perceiving the environment would look like, unless we want to think that babies are like zombies or something like that. Whereas the other sense that we were talking about before, where it's not just like feeling the environment, but also being aware of one's experiences, being able to introspect and so on. I think that does change with time, and it might require also having like a theory of what mental states are, right? Like, I don't think that we introspect our mental states in an atheoretical way. I think that we're influenced by how we in our society, in our time, in our culture, think about what consciousness states we can have, what kind of emotions we can have, and then we map them to whatever we're feeling. So I think depending on how we use the term, it might vary, not just in time, but by culture and so on.
Yeah, and I think, so Raj mentioned 2 points, right? Time and genes. So as far as genes, dictate to a certain degree the exact structure of our brain and other, connections and neural patterns, then I guess, yes, it does support that. With time, if we're speaking specifically about what we might call phenomenal consciousness, just how our sensory experience of the world around us, when you're born, for example, your visual acuity is quite poor. So I guess you aren't capable because of the apparatus to have the same phenomenal experience. But I guess after the first few months, there's no reason that I couldn't see that the phenomenal consciousness consciousness couldn't be somewhat the same, although it takes a while for you to develop certain, how can I say, higher order object processing, which may involve interactions with how we categorize objects. It might be influenced by language, etc. But as we get older, I mean, the various, there's at least 3 different ways that we can suffer disorders of consciousness. It can be for some sort of, trauma, some impact, non-traumatic, such as from a hemorrhage, stroke, whatever else, and also from disorders such as Alzheimer's. So as you get older, you do get, in many ways, perturbed consciousness in, degenerative disorders. So I think there's multiple ways to think about this. Good question, Raj.
Let's go to the next question.
Hi, so you talked a lot about experiences and like how feeling things and like, for example, outside, like, perceiving like the fire truck and things like that dictate kind of consciousness. So would it be possible, like if I wasn't experiencing anything through my senses, would I have lost consciousness effectively? Do I need to be actively experiencing something for me to be conscious, or is it just the ability to be able to experience something?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this in a way that might seem strange at first. There's this method now of growing brain-like structures in petri dishes, essentially called brain organoids, and they somewhat develop, in certain, patterns of activity and connections and cell types as normal brains. They're really small, right? But they don't have any means to interact with the environment. So there's no, sensory, organs such as eyes, ears, or whatever else. And so, the question to me then is, they have no sensory input to get at your question there. Is it possible that they're conscious? I think it would be difficult to have that phenomenal conscious without having some interaction with the environment. So, but I guess if you have the potential for sensory input, for example, and you just happen to occlude yourself like in a sensory deprivation tank, you still can have thoughts and whatever else, introspection, recall memories or whatever else. So there's still some form of consciousness there. So that's about, I guess, as close as I can get to your answer. Answering your question?
Yeah, I will add that this connects to the question about whether the internet can be conscious. I think we tend to focus a lot on the brain, and I like that. It's great, but we really have to remember that the only things that we know are conscious are in brains or organisms that have, sensoria that connect to the environment in the right way, in a unified way, at the right unit of time scale and space, right? Like that might be a problem for the internet hypothesis, even if it's true that information and the way, the nodes are connected might be important, but I think scale and unity are also something that matters a lot. And that's something the internet doesn't have, and maybe organelles in a petri dish don't have either. And this is also why I don't think that, understanding what consciousness or how consciousness arises from the brain, maybe it's a little bit less mysterious that sometimes philosophers like to make, because we do know, we have access to the world, some of its objective properties, and it's through the senses that we connect to them, and through the senses that we get our conscious experiences. So it's not so mysterious that red looks red if we know that, the external world has a particular type of property. So I think that we do need, some kind of connection to the environment to experience the world in the way we do, but also, we can basically activate those things maybe later in life, or people who recover sight, for example, later in life, they do have visual experiences in a pretty normal way. So it doesn't seem that you need, to have those connections to the environment active from the get-go, for example.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Laura, do we have one on? Okay, let's go to the mic here. And I'm sorry, this is the last question.
Professor Saalmann, in your discussion of the experiments of the rewiring of a ferret's brain, it's my understanding that the experimenters measured what, you forget my understanding here, they measured audio and visual sensation. In Thomas Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat essay, he talks about sonar perception and how that is such a fundamentally alien mode of experience to a human being that he argues it would be impossible for a human being to understand. Do you believe that this type of empirical observation would help us better understand modes of perception that humans do not have?
Short answer is yes, and I'll give you an example why. And maybe this could be employed in some way in the future in different species. But there was an experiment from Miguel Nicolelis's lab at Duke a few years ago, and they took a rat. And they said, the rat normally has 5 senses like our sensories. This is the senses of vision, touch, hearing, taste, smell. They said, I want to give it a new sense, a 6th sense, infrared sensation. And rats don't normally sense infrared. And so what they did was they implanted electrodes in the part of the brain that normally responds to sensations from the skin, what we call somatosensory cortex, or the part of the brain that responds to touch. And they had electrodes in there connected to an infrared sensor on the brain of the rat. And they trained the rat over much time to utilize the infrared light detector to actually guide behavior. So basically what would happen is they would switch the lights off in the enclosure of the rat, have these infrared lights. The sensor, whenever you point it towards a light, would start stimulating the brain through the implant that they had inside. And eventually, over time, the rodent could navigate in the dark using only infrared light. So now this rodent had one more sense than we did. And so the question then at that point is what's happening to the neurons in that sensory area? Did they lose the ability to experience touch? Well, actually, they were able to represent touch, it seems, as well as represent the infrared sense in an orthogonal way, in a way that doesn't interfere with your sense of touch. So the big question that they pose at that point is, does the rat experience the infrared sensation as touch, as when you touch the skin, or something new? And so there may be ways like this, where I showed you before with the ferret going towards audio-visual spouts, where you could develop something like that to test the rat. Could you do something like that then in humans, where you actually have a different sensory system, that you sort of give the brain access to, whether it's infrared, a magnetic sense, or whatever else? Teach us to actually use the information from that system, via an implant. And then we might be able to get some idea of how that extra sense might feel. Do we map it onto the sense of touch, for example, if the electrode's in the part of the brain that processes a touch, or do we conceptualize it as something new? So I think there's a way forward to test these sort of questions, but I can't say with any degree of certainty that, it would be experienced as something new, but it's definitely worth trying. People have tried, with prostheses, peripheral prostheses to stimulate on the tongue, for example, to give rise to different sensations with people who have some form of sensory damage. And people report all sorts of interesting, not obvious experiences that you might expect when you stimulate the tongue. So I think there's ways of getting at that question. It's just difficult, and obviously we should consider the ethics of these experiments and very carefully.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we could keep going on, but we have no more time. Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you to our speakers.